We're live.
It's working. Okay. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening, Rabbi Eisenberg. How are you?
Rosh Hashana, very well. How are you doing, David?
I'm very well, thank you. Now, this week's topic, forgiveness. We touched on it very briefly last week when we were talking. And I think the whole concept of forgiveness is, I think the saying goes, to sin is human and to forgive is divine or is godly. It's seen as being one of these characteristics that is beyond normal, because to forgive somebody properly, it takes a lot of swallowing of pride and understanding and all that sort of stuff. And it's something that very much plays into the themes of Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur. We're literally standing there asking for forgiveness for all different kinds of sins, not just the ones that happen between us, but also the ones that happen when other people can't see them as well. So it's interesting to get some Jewish perspectives on forgiveness and to have a look at, perhaps to examine some of the concepts and to see whether or not how important this is to us, how central it is to us, and whether at all it's something that is actually a sort of a positive commandment to us. So over to you.
All right, so let's start with the following. Good evening, Jonathan. Good evening, Adam. Good evening, Sheila. We'll start with that before we do anything else. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As always, thank you to David Mintz for arranging all the technicalities. I just show up and I speak, but David is really behind a lot of the other things, the adverts, etc., etc. So thank you to him for that as well. Pleasure. Forgiveness. I think forgiveness is an amazing thing. And when we read about forgiveness and when you understand forgiveness, I think looking at it from God's perspective, it's a much greater thing almost than looking at it from man's perspective. Because man, and this is maybe coming to that adage that you mentioned, that sinning is human and forgiving is godly. Man, sinning is very easy. We all know it's easy to sin. To forgive, okay, that's a little bit more difficult. But for God to forgive, really, if you were to think about it, forgiving means that I am able to forget, or I'm able to sort of not see it anymore. Now, forgetting is human, but it's not a godly thing. God doesn't forget. There's no way for God to forget. He can't. It's like this data bank that you can never, ever erase. So if I did something wrong, whatever that thing is, and I'm not going to pick on specific people and specific wrongdoings, right? But I've done something wrong, call it whatever it is. So then in God's memory bank, so to speak, it says Eisenberg didn't do this, or Eisenberg did this wrong. If I then turn around to God and say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do it, etc., okay, very good, but how am I going to get rid of this? It's just going to be there forever. And what the miracle of Teshuvah is, the miracle of Teshuvah is really twofold. Number one, the miracle of Teshuvah is that we're able to just get back to zero. That's the first thing. So if I'm able to take that, some further down, and I'm able to say I'm sorry to God and level things out again, that's an amazing thing. That's a miracle in and of itself. How is God going to forgive me? But God forgives me. But the other thing is that if you do Teshuvah properly, if you do Teshuvah out of love to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there comes level 2 of this. And level 2 of this is that we take that, when you have the Gemara tells us that if you've done Teshuvah me'ahava, out of love, zedonos, things that you've done on purpose, nasan lo kezachuyos, they become like you have now extra merits. And the reason you have extra merits is a very strange thing to say. Well, I did an Avera. How am I going to have extra merits by doing Averas? But the answer to that question is the following. If I've done something wrong, but then I've done Teshuvah, and the process of Teshuvah has brought me closer to God than I was previously, that actually the negative act that I did caused a greater connection. It's like, to give the example, sometimes you have a big fight with someone, and then if you're able to get past that fight and really properly make peace, sometimes your relationship is strengthened by the fact that you had this argument. We had the argument, we got over it, we're friends again, and we're better than we were before. That's really, so that's the idea. That's the two-sided coin of teshuvah, the regular teshuvah and the supersized teshuvah. And we as human beings look at the way God functions with us, and this is almost a double mirror. We look at the way God functions and we need to say, you know what? God is willing to forgive, and therefore I should also forgive. Certain things I'm not obligated to forgive. Most things I am obligated to forgive. We'll talk about that later. But then there's another part to it, and we'll talk about each one of these things separately, is that God sometimes treats us the way we treat others. So God's looking at you and saying, you had a whole bunch of foibles with people this year. Are you willing to forgive other people? So you're like, no, I'm not going to forgive anybody. So God's like, all right, well, if you're not the kind of person that forgives, then that's how I'm going to behave with you as well. Good evening, Mr. President. Whereas if you say, yes, people have wronged me, and it happens, people have wronged me over the year, but I'm willing to look away, and then God says, well, if you have the ability to look away, and that's how you treat other people, then I can start looking away at the things that you've done as well. But if you're going to hold on to every little thing, then God says, I got a lot more to hold on to by you than you have to hold on anybody else. So they're really different parts to this discussion, all part of tonight.
But if we were to look at our history, and if we were to look at the Torah and what that says in regards to sins, it's basically, well, it's not a catalogue of sins, but there are some major ones in there.
Oh yeah.
Starting with right at the beginning, Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden there.
Yes.
And the original sin, as it were.
Yes.
And then
Cain and Abel, not much better.
But you then by the next century you're at Noach, where God has decided that the world and its inhabitants such a mess that effectively needs to restart.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, that to start, you're effectively starting the history of all time with stories about sinning and about the worst case scenario, if you like, of what God may do in his infinite power and wisdom, if we don't adhere to some decency.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's a theme that sort of echoes the whole way through. And I think then, if you, by the time you get to the actual people of Israel as we know them today, the Jewish people, their first major collective sin would have been the Egel, right? Would have been the golden calf.
That's the biggest one, but there were sins before then already. We have the sin by the manna. We have the sin of the complaining for the water before they get. We have the fact that we read that the Jewish people are standing at the Sea of Reeds on the seventh day of Pesach, about to cross into that sea, and what happens is the Jewish people. Good evening, Adam Patrick. Yeah, we've said hello many times. Yeah. The Jews are standing there by the sea, and they turn to Moshe Rabbeinu and they say, Moshe Rabbeinu, were there no graveyards in Egypt? You have to take us, this is a more convenient graveyard. Like, what are you doing to us? So we see the Jewish people throughout the desert seem to have a pretty bad track record. We read about sin after sin after sin. However, if you were to think about it, it's 40 years worth. So if you read about 5 or 10 sins, big sins within 40 years, it's not a massive amount. But each one of those sins still left its mark.
And it has a repercussion, doesn't it? Each
Some
episode.
of them more than others. The main one that have repercussions are the sin of the golden calf and the sin of the Meraglim, the spies that came to Israel. So those sort of cumulatively then created the idea of Tisha B'Av and everything that came after it. Korach doesn't really have repercussions, but I think there's a lot to be learned from Korach and the idea of machlokes. That's your machlokes, par excellence. There's your bona fide machlokes. You got Korach.
Korach, we had that episode where the ground swallows them up, right?
Yeah, but that was but that's the end of it. That's the repercussion. But before you read about really the argument and what cynicism can do and what jealousy can do, and how we can tear people apart for power, for own egotistical reasons. There's a lot in there that's very much human nature and for us to learn about, just to see how people can fall.
So it's human nature to make mistakes. It's human nature to sin. We all are guilty of doing things to one another, sometimes without even directly meaning it or thinking it, but we do. Now, we live today in an age where I think everything's under the microscope in terms of the way that we try and act to other human beings in general, in terms of where political correctness has taken us to today, in terms of not wanting to, and the very, very basis of that is not wanting to cause offense to anybody, of any kind. Now, a lot of people would think that has gone way too far, that we as a society are too sensitive nowadays, and we've become we get too offended too easily. What would you say about this?
That's a really hard discussion. I don't even want to start talking about specific things, but on the other hand, if you think about,
it's not a loaded
Black
question.
Lives, you can think about the Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, of course, Black Lives Matter, and we should all realize, and we should all recognize and fully buy into the idea that Black Lives Matter. Of course, Black Lives Matter. Nobody has ever said that Black lives don't matter. However, there are certain instances that cause people to think, well, Black lives don't matter. If police brutality against Black people is allowed, then it must be that Black lives don't matter. Others say, well, look at the statistics. The amount of holdups there are by the police of people within the United States, most of which, probably 99.9% of which, end without any significant amount of violence. And every time there is a significant amount of violence, people try and say, Black lives don't matter. And the police are like, well, what do you want us to do? I fear that sometimes for this idea of political correctness, on the other hand, we're tying the police's arms behind their back. If you're a policeman, a white policeman in America that wants to stop a Black individual who has done something wrong, you're now worried. What happens if things go wrong?
It's extremely charged, that whole section of society, and particularly in America. I don't think we feel it as much over here, but I'm sure the same sort of thing occurs. You get instances of what they call institutionalized racism, where
look, there are no Black managers in the Premier League. I think a lot of people point to that and saying that's institutional racism. Why are there no Black managers in the Premier League? Right? They will say there's, and there are a lot of things that point towards that say, well, maybe there is institutional racism in certain cases. And there might be. I think we have less of a problem with the police brutality because our police don't carry guns. So I think we're sort of already one step away. So the worst, in inverted commas, things that could happen is you could taser someone. But it is really, it's going to get very, those conversations are very, very difficult. And you and I, we had a conversation about political correctness at one point here within the shul, where, somebody gave their opinion and somebody else says, well, that opinion goes against what I believe, and therefore you're considered a racist. And that's, people are allowed to have opinions, even sometimes, if it's a moral decision, sometimes you're allowed to have an opinion even against that.
And I think, at least to me anyway, I mean, it's great if you've got the guts to be able to say, I'm sorry, when you realize that you've overstepped the mark. That's one thing. But I think the willingness to forgive people and to actually not hold that grudge for or to grind the axe for as long as you possibly can. That is something you don't often see, but there are sometimes people, they get hold of an argument, they will just not let it go, no matter what you do to ask for forgiveness. But Robert Nathan has written in, Judaism teaches forgiveness, but the victim has to accept forgiveness. What if the victim won't accept forgiveness? What can one do?
That's an excellent question, Robert. So the question is discussed in the Gemara, and the question is discussed in Shulchan Aruch as well. So let's deal with that question and come back to what you were speaking about afterwards, David, as well. And that is, if you want to ask somebody for forgiveness, you need to, number one, you need to walk over to that person and you need to either personally or sending somebody else really ask for forgiveness. That means I've seen people, or I remember when there was an issue once in shul, and I remember speaking to Rabbi Malcolm Herman about this. You know Rabbi Herman from from London.
Oh yeah, absolutely, from Seed.
Yeah, it's the brother of Rabbi Herman from Higher Prestwich. Yeah, so this Rabbi Herman, I've spoken to him on occasion about certain things that had gone wrong for me within the shul and to get advice, because he's somebody who really understands human nature. And he said to me at the time, he said, listen, David, if you're going to go apologize, you have to be willing to apologize unreservedly. And, I've taken that on board many times when it comes to apologies, because if you're going to say to someone, so I'm going to come to you, David, let's say I've wronged you, and I've come to you and I say, David, I'm really sorry, but I want you to know it's not really my fault. Yeah? What kind of apology is that?
Or worse, when you make an apology, you say, I'm sorry if what I said made you feel in such and such a way.
Yeah.
But
I didn't mean to offend you, but if that's how you felt, then I'm sorry that you felt that way.
Yeah, that's a non-apology. Yeah.
There are a lot of these non-apology comments that people make. No, it wasn't me, but I think you felt you understood my comment incorrectly. So I just want to set it straight. So don't do that. Go to the person and apologize. And in halacha says you go to a person 3 times and apologize to him 3 times properly. Not I'm sorry, no, I'm sorry, no, I'm sorry, no. Okay, I'm done. You go over and you explain it to him and you try really to make peace with the person and you apologize and the person's not willing to accept your apology. And you go again with some other people and you try a second time and he doesn't accept your apology. And if you do it a 3rd time and he still doesn't accept your apology, then in halacha you have done what you need to do. Beyond that, halachically, you don't have to go and seek his apology anymore. I've done what I need to do, and at one point or another. Now, I would add to that, there are times where that the person whom you're apologizing to is just not in a state yet to accept your apology. Sometimes you've hurt somebody very, very badly. You can't go to that person half an hour later and make an apology. It's just too raw, it's too soon, and sometimes you'll have to give it that time. So I think it needs to all within the boundaries of what's sensible. But if you've been sensible about the way you've made your apology, you've asked your apology 3 times, and the fellow 3 times has said, I am not willing to forgive you no matter what, then Judaism says you have done your bit, and now it's on his head for the fact that he's not willing to accept your apology.
But there are different types of forgiveness, isn't there? So when we talk about being willing to give somebody forgiveness, there are 3 types. One is slicha, kapara, and mechila. So if you are, and I think only 2 of those is in our gift as humans. The other one, so kapara, which is total atonement,
right,
is something only God can grant. That's not.
Well, that's what he said. Total eradication, and only God can totally eradicate it as if it never existed. For us, always in the back of your mind, you'll always think, well, but he did something wrong. Yeah, I remember that. Would I give a time frame? I can't give a time frame for that. It's a good question, Robert. I don't think I can give a time frame. It really depends on how grave the sin was. It's each case will be separate. But I would say within what we would consider to be sort of reasonable, considering whatever it is that happened. So it's an excellent question. I don't know if there's a real time frame for that. But like you said, David, you have kapara, something that to entirely eradicate. I don't know if it's possible for humans. It's interesting because I often thought about this saying. I don't know if you've ever heard this. I remember in German there used to be this saying, and they always used to say it in the name of Simon Wiesenthal. Vergeben, aber nicht vergessen. That was the German saying, which means forgive but don't forget.
Yeah.
But I always wondered, what does it mean to forgive and not forget? Then have you really forgiven?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. But there is, you are able to. So when they talk about forgiveness or offending somebody, we in English we say, "I owe you an apology." So we talk about it as almost being a debt. It's something that you owe to this other person. And just as with debt, you can ask for that debt to be repaid,
Yes.
or you can pardon that debt. You can say, you know what, forget about it. Just keep the money. It's not worth it. So I think that when somebody comes to you and they offer you an apology, and you know that they're trying to make amends, you may not ever forget what they did to you, but I think that is the most superficial level of accepting forgiveness, if you like. It's almost more for them than it is for you. You're letting them go. You're saying, look, okay, we're done, thank you.
Right.
And I think in that way you don't need to forget what they've done. And I think as humans, it's very difficult to forget, especially things that deeply hurt us. These are things that, we used to call them character building, but when we say character building, these are things that scar us for life and teach us life lessons, if you like. And
I guess, but character gets built very often through those scars. That's a very big way of building our character.
We've got some good questions coming in. Eliza Chaya Charkham, my sister. How you doing, Eliza? Nice to hear from you. What happens if you forgive someone, but then they do something again to you? She's not talking about her brother, I'm pretty sure. But that's interesting. So you do, if you forget, we all have this. Very often it can happen in business where people might apologize for something and yet they reoffend very, very quickly. So how long are you meant to keep forgiving people for if they reoffend?
So it's interesting. In halacha, we often look, again, we're looking at the way God does things. And the Gemara tells us, the Mishnah tells us in Yom Kippur, in Yuma, in the Mishnah about Yom Kippur, Ha'omer echta va'ashuv echta va'ashuv ema speaking the other last tshuva. That means if somebody says, like sometimes we do before Rosh Hashana, you know what? God's nice. He'll forgive me. So you do sins, and you come Rosh Hashana, Yom Kippur, you say, God, I'm sorry. And God goes, all right, fine. You go right back, Matzah, Yom Kippur goes, I said sorry. He was dumb enough to accept my apology, right back to where I'm at. Now, God's not stupid. You can say whatever you want about God, but stupid he's not. Yeah. And therefore, God says, look, I know if you sincerely wanted to apologize, fine, I accept the apology. If you never meant to apologize, then I'm not going to accept your apology. And I think the same is true also. Sometimes we see there are people that apologize, but in reality, they don't really want to apologize. They know they're going to reoffend. So after a while, I don't think you don't have to allow people that are constantly taking advantage of you and your goodwill you don't have to keep on saying, oh, I'm so sorry, fine, it's okay. And then 2 days later, they'll, there are certain people, they take you and they turn you into the butt of their jokes.
Yeah.
You become the guy that they always make fun of. Sadly, in schools, bullying, and then they sort of say, oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, fine, it's fine. 2 days later, make jokes about you again. After a while, you say, look, I'm just not taking apologies anymore. There's no point. If you're going to keep on insulting me, why do you keep on saying I'm sorry? Saying sorry at one point also becomes insulting. I'm insulted that you think I'm dumb enough to take your apology that often when you keep on reoffending a day later.
I think that if you can accept somebody's apology and they keep reoffending, well, then at that point, the words. Robert Nathan says here, I keep thinking it's not what you say, but how you say it in the words. But sometimes it's easy to say things in words. I could say anything you like in words. It's something I do well, but again, actions speak louder than words. So that's true. If you stop offending people, then that's what makes the real difference. What I would say to Elisa,
I think it's a combination of both, really, because I think, if you didn't apologize properly, even if you stopped offending, you've not really apologized. And if you apologize properly, like you said, I can say almost anything, but you keep on reoffending, you've also not made up for things. So it's really a combination of apologizing properly and then keeping away from what you've done. Otherwise, I think that you've not really done what you're supposed to, in order to gain that forgiveness.
Elisa, what I'd say is I think everybody. It's true, everybody needs a second chance, but I think they also need a third chance. And I think after that, my 3 strikes and you're out rule applies. Okay, Clive Moss Barkley. Why didn't God forgive us for the sin of the spies and has made us suffer on Tisha B'Av over the past 3,000 years? Now,
Interesting question.
It's an interesting question, but I think the act of, so if you go back to Mishnayos when we're talking about Tanis, and we're talking about the act of fasting, and we touched on this when we were discussing Tisha B'Av, but the act of fasting is really, it's a man-made act for ourselves. It's something that we do to show outwardly that we are suffering. It's not necessarily that, I mean,
it was more to get us in the mood to do teshuvah, is what we said at the time. It was more sort of like I think when you fast and you move away from physicality. So when you're eating, you're busy with the physical. So the more you're busy with the physical, the less you can sort of get in touch with the spiritual. And what we're trying to do on Tisha B'Av is, or on any fast day, is move away from the physical, get a much better view of what's going on, and try to say, okay, I see now with a greater clarity, I've made a mistake. I'd like to make amends for it. I think coming back to Clive's point, it's a difficult question, but I guess the answer to that is that we didn't, we've not really done our job at making up for it. So until we do our job for making up for it, so then we're not going to, it's not going to really be fully forgiven. It is one of those difficult questions.
It is very difficult. Do you think it's made more difficult these days in terms of when we forgive and when we pray for forgiveness, those prayers really are they're replacing certain ritual things that we used to do in order to ask for forgiveness. We used to bring sacrifices, and that whole word kapara, there was a very clear. I think we talk about it actually on Yom Kippur. We go into
and Musaf, we go into great detail about what happened in the temple.
Yeah, but it's more difficult for us today.
I don't know. So that's an interesting question. I don't know if it's more difficult or if it's easier. On the one hand, it is more difficult because it means we need to do it ourselves. On the other hand, I feel it has a certain amount of, personal touch to it. In a way that, if you had gone to the Beis Hamikdash in those days and you'd watch the Kohen Gadol do the rituals and everything, and then, I don't think that the rituals in and of themselves created the tshuva. I mean, the Gemara says, or the Mishnah says, you can't just allow the Kohen Gadol to slaughter whatever it might be, and you say, you know what, I did everything wrong the whole year round, and then the Kohen Gadol brings 2 offerings on Yom Kippur, and we're all good, we're all straightened out again. So you need to do it teshuvah. But I find our process of Yom Kippur and everything that we have actually allows us to be very much in the driver's seat. Whereas in the Beis Hamikdash, you were not in the driver's seat. You watch somebody else being in the driver's seat. So it allows me to say vidui and to ask God for forgiveness, to really contemplate my sins and what I did wrong. And, I don't know that they didn't really have that similar process of tefillah in the Beis Hamikdash. So one of the things that we gain from having Yom Kippur the way it is actually having a personal involvement in a way that didn't exist previously.
Rodney has commented, good evening, Rodney. Maybe God did forgive us for the spies, and it's maybe the Rabbonim's decision that we carry on suffering.
That's an interesting question, but I'm not sure, what suffering we as Rabbonim have brought up on the people. We might have, we might not have. You might not like my drasha. I'm sorry, Rodney, but I don't know if that's the suffering that we're talking about. The suffering that we have is we don't have the Beis Hamikdash. We don't have Mashiach yet. That suffering still remains, and that's not going to change until God brings it to an end. So I'm not sure if it's the Rabbanim's decision to carry on suffering. Maybe clarify that slightly.
So we've got Clive Moss Barkley here as well. Erev Rosh Hashana, we retrospectively ask forgiveness for any vows we make in the coming year. How can that work? So how is it? I mean, a vow is something that's, my word is my bond. It's meant to be something unbreakable. Rodney says he loves your drushes. So
thank you, Rodney. I appreciate that.
You don't need to apologize for that.
Okay.
So, but how does it work? How can we suddenly annul vows? Now, it's interesting because some people say that if you get to Yom Kippur, we can also annul can you also annul
But
debt
Kol
as
Nidre
well?
actually is an annulment of vows again.
Right.
Strangely enough, Kol Nidre says all these things are annulments, or the vows, etc., that are done should not be vows. The annulment of vows is an interesting thing in halacha. The Jewish people sometimes suffer tremendously from the idea of the annulment of vows because the Christians and others said, well, they're not honest people because they say whatever they say and then they go into shul on Rosh Hashana and they say, I didn't mean it, and then that's it. So an annulment of a vow is they're very specific vows that you can annul. You can't annul any vow that you want to. So only, if I promised money to tzedakah, I can't annul that vow and just say, well, I don't really owe that money to tzedakah now. Okay, I'm promising the shul £1,000. Just kidding. My word's a word. There's certain vows in halacha that where the halacha says, had I known that certain things, certain circumstances would have happened, I wouldn't have made that vow. So then maybe you can take it back in certain instances. But it's a very, very specific category of vows, and it's only very specific instances. You cannot just annul any vow willy-nilly as you feel like it, because it just, it would make turn us into liars. And then that's one thing
it
that
also has repercussions on financial transactions as well, doesn't it?
It would, but I think in the end of the day, if you've if you promise somebody money, if you owe somebody money, you can't say, well, I annul the vow and therefore I don't owe the money anymore. It's you can't do. You meet a guy after Rosh Hashana, he says, you still owe me £1,000. I annulled that vow. I don't owe it to you anymore. Yeah, that's not the way it works.
Let me ask you a more difficult question. Do you think that there are limits on forgiveness? So if I were to ask you, this is a very difficult discussion, but if I were to say, look, is it time to forgive? Have we forgiven the Germans for what they did? Can we forgive people for such huge violations? Is that possible? Are there limits to forgiveness?
I think there are limits to forgiveness. Even in halacha, the halacha says there's certain limits to forgiveness and certain things you don't need to forgive. So if somebody has been motzi shemra, has spread a very terrible rumor about you, which is false, you're not obligated to forgive the person. And the Gemara and the way the halacha explains it is because you sometimes, wow, somebody listening from Pakistan. Hello there from hello. Thank you for joining us from Pakistan. I think it's Dibar. I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, Dibar.
I think you are.
So somebody, where were we up to now? Yeah, somebody spreads a bad rumor about you. You can forgive them, but that rumor can go around everywhere. If I said something terrible about another person, that he was, I don't know, makeup or something. I said about somebody who was unfaithful to his wife, and that went around the whole shul and then makes its way around the entire community. How are you ever going to undo that? How do you ever undo that? How do you undo a public broadcast of that sort about an individual? It's just impossible. And so therefore, because the damage cannot be undone, therefore you're not really obligated to forgive him. You're not obligated. However, in halacha it still says, if you can find it in your heart to forgive him, it's still considered a very meritorious thing to forgive that person anyway.
I think it's amazing if you can do that.
If you could do that, it'd be terrible. I mean, yeah. But I think, so Clive, that's an interesting question. And I think I want to come back to that point. Have we forgiven the Spanish for the expulsion 500 years ago? If not, why do we all go to Spain for our holidays? So I think there's the answer. I don't think we've forgiven them, but we've forgotten it. I think it's the other way around. So I think when he says forgive and don't forget, it's the other way around. And this is an important point to make, that number one, we as a collective people, we have and in general, humanity has a short-term memory, not a very long. I think when you speak nowadays about the Holocaust, I don't know if you've heard this, but I remember growing up in Austria, and so many times people came and they said, you stole this from us and you took that away. The amount of money and the amount of looting and the amount of property that was stolen from the Jewish people in Austria is just unbelievable. The sheer numbers are just unfathomable.
Yeah.
And yet, when people come back and ask for their money back, people are like, oh, all these Jews constantly want their money. And haven't we heard enough of the Holocaust? And haven't you made enough of a fuss about it? And haven't we paid back enough money yet? So I don't know if it's them just wanting to get rid of their conscience, or if they just feel after 50 years, we've given for the last 50 years. We're trying to will you guys stop? You're like leeches. Like you leech onto something you don't let go.
It's interesting. I think when you meet modern day Germans and whose grandparents or great grandparents may have been in the offending generation, but they themselves are maybe a generation or two removed from that whole situation.
Yeah.
There is this, although they have a very strong sense of history in terms of what did happen, and in some respects, I've met people that are ashamed of what their grandparents did, and I've
Yeah.
met people that are ashamed, but also very, they get very upset very quickly. They get very frustrated and very angry, and the conversation does turn to, well, for how long are you going to blame me for something that was entirely out of my control? And it's an interesting question where we as humans, how often do we carry that pain, if you like, and how long are you going to make them remember it? And I would argue with the Spanish, we sort of reached that stage where mostly it's not really mentioned that much, is it?
No, I don't think anybody speaks about the expulsion. I mean, we don't speak much about the expulsion from Spain at all. You know, the expulsion from Spain was, but I don't think that's because we've forgiven the Spanish for expelling the Jews. I don't think anybody said, like, you know what, in hindsight, that was okay. Nobody's saying in hindsight that was okay. We just say that's so far back in history. You know, at this point, it's still, like you said, it's, well, my grandfather suffered at the hands of your grandfather. So my grandfather, I still knew my grandfather. You still knew your grandfather, and they were still from the generation of the Holocaust. So I can say there is somebody whom I tangibly knew who was affected and who was haunted by what your grandparents, whom you might have known, did to my grandfather. But I'm wondering if in 2 or 3 generations' time, where you say my great-great-grandfather 150 years ago, something not nice happened to him by your great-grandfather 150 years ago, that starts becoming like a conversation that starts sounding a lot more like, all right, guys, just let go. I think maybe that the idea is,
Clive's answering his own questions. Richard the Lionheart expelled Jews from England, yet we all live here. Look, I think it's a story that I was amazed that the people still settled again in Austria and Germany. You know, people.
Yeah. But the people that settled in Austria, that, you know, you'll rarely find someone that was Austrian from before 1938 who resettled in Austria. So almost everybody who settled in Austria after 1945 was not originally Austrian beforehand. Because those people that grew up in Austria couldn't bring themselves to come back. They said, but what my neighbors did to me, I couldn't come back. The interesting thing is you had Polish Jews who had terrible things that happened to them at the hands of the Poles that were willing to sell in Austria because they said, well, I didn't see what the Austrians did. I know the Austrians were in on this also, but I never saw it, so I'm happy to live here. It's strange, but that's what happens.
So the excitement of a Facebook Live is you never know who's going to stop in. So Deebar, our friend from Pakistan, has asked us a question as regards Jesus's or Christianity's teachings on forgiveness.
Right.
And there is quite a lot of it, isn't there, in terms of turning the other cheek and
so interesting. Yeah, I think Judaism doesn't believe fully in turning the other cheek. So if somebody is attacking you, there's no mitzvah to turn the other cheek and let them attack you. You know, you are allowed to fight back, and you are allowed to you're allowed to take up defense for yourself. You're not obligated to turn the other cheek. But once you're finished, if you can come to some kind of conclusion, forgiveness is a great thing. But I don't think we say forgiveness overall, or that we should always forgive no matter what, because I don't know if we take the lesson of forgiveness as far as they do within Christianity.
But forgiveness is so important, and yet we sometimes forget it. And we tend to sort of store it up for sort of one time in the year for sort of a couple of weeks where we concentrate on mending all the wrongs and making amends with people. And yet it's something that it's such an important concept that it's the last thing that we do. But I mean, I didn't know this, but actually I was talking to you about some of the more unpleasant sides of your job, and one of those is that you have to visit people on their deathbed.
Yeah.
And the last prayer that you will say for a person that is about to meet their maker, as it were, is vidui. It's
Correct.
confession, isn't it?
Correct.
So, and that again is mirrored with what we do on Yom Kippur as well.
Correct. But what I would say to just preface what you were saying is that it actually, when I was preparing for today, halacha actually tells us that you should always try to forgive even before Yom Kippur. Don't wait and store everything up for Yom Kippur to have to ask one big forgiveness from everybody. If you can settle an argument earlier, that's much better. I can think back to a time in my rabbinate very, very early on where there was an individual who was quite upset with me. And I went to their house to try to seek forgiveness, and it went very badly. Clive, who's here, Clive Barkley, will know a lot of the details of this story. But I was early on. I wasn't, I didn't really have the same, I guess, tools, experience that I have now, and I probably would have handled it very differently. And I remember that, I went and I tried and it didn't work. And then it was awkward for literally almost an entire year. Whenever the fellow walked into shul, my heart dropped and I'm like, oh goodness, now what? And then finally, it was actually very strange because on Erev Rosh Hashana, I went to drop off a wine bottle at someone's house who was part of the executive. And as I came out of his house, I was directly opposite this other person's house. I had another bottle of wine in my car that I'd really set aside for one of my son's rebbeim. And I looked down and I looked at the house. And I said, no. I pulled off the card and I knocked on and I said, dear so and so, we got off to the wrong start. I want to give you this for Rosh Hashana. I want to apologize to you, and I hope that next year we get on better. But I look back at that and I say to myself, the argument happened probably sometime in November, and I only mended the argument in September the year after. And for 10 months, I had all this pent up frustration and discomfort every time he walked into shul, I walked into shul. Every time we had a conversation, it was very stilted and awkward. And I look back, I said, why did I wait 10 months to do that? That was just silly. Yeah, you know what? You failed the first time. Give it another 3 or 4 weeks. Give it another 2 weeks maybe. Call up again and say, look, I'm really sorry. I tried to ask you forgiveness last time. It didn't work. Can we sit together and try again? I really do want to mend this. I shouldn't have had, it was sort of fortuitous that I was literally outside his house when I was dropping off that bottle of wine, because it wouldn't have happened to me then. But when I came out and I gave him that bottle of wine, I should have done that so much earlier. I could have done that so much earlier. And I could have saved myself and him so much heartache. So, it's, even though Rosh Hashana Yom Kippur is a time always to forgive people, but really we should try to do it earlier. There's actually a prayer. Yeah.
Now, I was going to say there's not many people that can once you go and apologize to them, if you've done the job properly, there's not many people that can keep going and keep carrying that grudge for a long time.
So I think, looking back, I didn't apologize properly either, because again, learning the lessons from then, yes, I apologized, but it wasn't unreserved. And yes, I apologized, but I made plenty of my own points. And I made plenty of excuses. And then when you sit and you're making the excuses and you're trying to explain why it is that you did this and why it is, they don't care why you did it. They don't really want to, I'm sorry this happened, but I thought this, and I thought, just apologize. Say, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I apologize. And had I done that, I could have probably saved myself half an hour of an uncomfortable conversation, being yelled at, leaving the house. It was the whole situation was extremely uncomfortable. And if I had today's experience, I probably would have been able to handle it better. But every night, actually, the people that say Kriya Shema Lamikra, they say the special Shema before they go to sleep, the prayer that you say over there is, I'll pull it up for you. It says the following before you go to sleep. Ribbon Shalom, dear God, Hareini Mochel, I forgive to anybody that upset me or that bothered me, that sinned against me, whether it was physical, whether it was financial, whether it was with my honor, anything else that he did, whether he did it by accident, whether he did it on purpose, whether he did it, he wanted to, whether he was talking, etc., etc. It's a very it's quite an interesting thing that you say on Kriya Shema at night. And I know some people say they feel bad to say it by Kriya Shema at night because they have that person in the back of their mind that, like, everyone except for Bob. Bob by the way, at the moment. Ribbono Shel Olam, I forgive everybody, but not Bob. Yeah. But at the end of the day, at the end of our lives, we that's part of what we do, is sort of to cleanse ourselves from the fact that we're holding on to sins from other people. And we say, you know what? I forgive everybody. I'm willing to let go.
I think that being selfish now for a second, when you do forgive somebody, you do an awful lot for yourself. It's like somebody, as much as when you go and you have to stand in front of somebody and ask for forgiveness, that's very, very difficult. But there's a part of your soul that's never going to be complete until you actually ask for forgiveness and this person's pardoned you, as it were. But when you're the one doing the pardoning, that's tremendous power, but it also lifts the weight off you as well. Nobody wants all this ill feeling. It's easier to, I mean, it's easier said than done. Some people
much easier, but I know, for example, from personal experience, somebody very close to me said to me, that told me this story, that they were holding resentment about a specific story, and I kept on saying to them, you just got to let go of it, and they were like, no, I can't. And I said, just forget about the other person and what they did, but it's driving you crazy. It's driving you up a wall. And why are you doing this to yourself? The more you hold on to it, and then on one upon another, this person was actually willing to pick up the phone and say, look, I don't know why you did it, and I don't know, but I shouldn't have judged you, and I forgive you. And for that person, it was very, that person came off the phone then in tears and said, I feel so much better. It's just this weight lifted off my shoulder, because to hold on to an argument, to hold on to broigas with people it's emotionally challenging. It's really, really hard to constantly feel that. And sometimes when we forgive, we don't even need to give for the other person. Sometimes we should forgive for ourselves. Forgive other people because it allows you to say goodbye to that story. Forget about whether the other person deserves a forgiveness or not. But if I say, yes, you know what, I accept your forgiveness, then I've let go. And once I've let go, it's gone. And when it's gone, it doesn't take up so much headspace.
And heartache as well. It's just that is terrible. You see it the whole time, and you sometimes see it with families, with very close families, where they have a broigus that lasts for generations.
Generations.
And it's usually over materialistic things anyway, money and honor and covered and.
So one of my favorite stories I actually heard about forgiveness is. He used to live in England. He doesn't live in England anymore. Rabbi Shlomo Farhi, who now is the rabbi of the Safra Synagogue in New York, but was a rabbi at Aish for many, many years in London. He said he came up to Birmingham once, and he was giving a speech in Birmingham about forgiveness. And he said, the joke is that sometimes you don't even remember 50 years later that, you have this argument, and you have this argument, and you don't even remember what the argument was about. You just remember that my side of the family doesn't talk to their side of the family. Well, why not? Well, I don't know. There was some kind of story once with some kind of flat. I don't even know. Yeah. But you're like the grandchild. What difference does it make? So he was saying this whole story, and he saw this old man making his way to the front. And he says, I've not spoken to my sister in 60 years, not 50 years like the joke that you told.
Yeah.
I've not spoken, because he told the joke about the guy standing by the caver and was crying. He says, why are you crying? Were you close? No, we weren't close, but he was my brother. So he says, but why are you crying? He says, because we fought for 50 years and I don't remember what we fought about. So that's what I don't even remember what the argument. So he told that story, and the guy says, I've been fighting with my sister for 60 years and I remember exactly what it's all about. So I said to him, well, what was it all about? What was that terrible argument? So he said, you know what? My father, when he died, he left very little, but he had one heirloom. He had this menorah that he had received from his grandmother from the Alta Heim in Poland. And I said to my sister at the time, you can get rid of everything, but make sure, because you must see this many times when you come into houses after people have passed away and you're there to help out as an estate agent, the amount of garbage that people accumulate over a lifetime and that needs to be gotten rid of before the next person moves in is just sometimes it's staggering how much stuff people hold on to.
It's mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling what we have.
And it's sad. It's because when you go in and you look at the contents of somebody's house and the family haven't cleared it yet, that is it's the very sort of nature and character of that person bottled and distilled and echoed in the type of art that they liked and the type of food they used to eat, or the pictures of and you can see. I mean, it's hard enough when you have to do it for your own family, and sometimes you go into other people and you see how they. So, what in your story? What happened to the menorah?
So what happens is, the guy says to the woman, so the guy says, I said to my sister, you can get rid of the entire flat. There's nothing in there that's of value, but the menorah you have to keep. And I came back, I came back to the flat a couple of weeks later, and I said to my sister, where's the menorah? And she goes, oh no, I got rid of it. I chucked it. I'm so sorry. I says, what, you chucked the menorah? Yeah, but I told you not to chuck that menorah. I'm so sorry. And he says, I couldn't believe she did that. I couldn't believe she wouldn't listen to that and throw at that menorah, that heirloom of our family. And I said, that was it. We were through, and I've not spoken to her since in 60 years. So the guy, Rabbi Farhi looked at this guy and says, well, what was so important about the menorah? What's so important? He says, what do you mean? What's so important about the menorah? That menorah was like family. It was from generations and generations from Poland. Do you understand that what kind of part of our family this menorah was? So Rabbi Farhi looked at the guy and says, I don't, with all due respect, but I'm going to now say something. I hope you don't take this the wrong way. But are you telling me that for a menorah, which is like family, you got rid of your real family, your sister? That's what you did?
Good point.
Yeah. And he said there was suddenly this look that descended upon this old man. As he said it, the guy suddenly went, oh.
Yeah.
And he started crying, and he turned around and says, excuse me, I have a phone call to make that's 60 years late. And he went out and he made that phone call.
Yeah.
To me, that's one of the most amazing stories that you can have somebody 60 years holding on to this bregas. 60 years. What did you hold on to it for 60 years? What was the point of holding on to that machlokes? What did you gain by holding on to it? And not only that, over menorah, I'm not saying it's a stupid thing to it's a family heirloom. Fine, I understand it meant a lot to you. But you got rid of something worth so much more over a piece of tin or a piece of brass. It wasn't even worth a lot of money. And so you didn't talk to your sister for 60 years because of that? And sometimes we forget. So then people will say, all right, but that's only that. I've heard of families that are fighting about money that where they've spent in the tens of millions of pounds on the lawyer fees. Do you know how much money they're fighting about? You say that they couldn't spend that money if they tried. And so what? So somebody got another 5 or 10 million. You got 10 and they got 20. That's really worth fighting about. And in the end, everybody will be left with 2, and the lawyers get 18 on each side. That's stupid. So
life is too short to carry these things around. And I think if we as human beings expect, and this is really it, when you talk about Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur, we expect that if we do our job correctly and we tick all those boxes, and we fast and we pray with kavanah and we do all the right things and we say all the right things, we expect that God's going to forgive us. That's our expectation.
There is an expectation. I know if we can actually sort of really expect that, but that is our expectation. God's not obligated to forgive us, but there's a certain expectation that we
have. But I wish sometimes that people would have the same expectations on themselves, and when it comes to personal matters that they won't let go of, they should understand that actually sometimes forgiving certain things does more for them than they'll ever believe. I don't think anybody ever died with a broigus that they then afterwards thought, oh, well, it was great that I managed to carry that for 56 years.
That was so worth it.
It doesn't matter.
People are crazy that way with the Clive's repeating your adage from before. Yeah, people are crazy. I mean, the craziest story that I ever heard. Again, I don't know if this one's true or not. The other one I know is true. I don't know if this one's true. That there were two sisters that went in an argument, and then right before one of them was dying, and the other one, so she called her sister that was still healthy, and the other sister felt okay. We know we're going to make up. And she comes to the hospital, and her sister's lying there, and she's very, very ill, and she beckons her sister, come nearer. She comes closer, she comes even nearer. And she feels like, she's so schwach, she probably can't get the words out. Come just right over me. And she bends over, and the sister jumps up, bites her really, really hard, and then lies back and says, and now I can die in peace. Now, sometimes that's what we're like. We're just crazy. Just let go. Just let go. I knew people that where one of the sisters was literally dying, a young woman was dying with cancer, and they wanted to make up with another side of the family, and the other side of the family says, no, we won't make up with you. And you think to yourself, in the face of death, make peace.
What else could be more important?
Yeah. In the face of death, make peace. I think somehow, what was that story? I think a few years ago, many years ago, actually, there was somebody that passed away in Vienna, and by the Shmira, somehow there was a mistake that was made, and there was two people that were sitting Shmir together over this body, and two people that were having a huge machlokes. Somehow that whoever was in charge of the Shmira wrote to put those two people together unknowingly. And what happened basically was they both came in and they had to look at the dead cadaver, and then they looked at each other and said, you know what, I think we should make peace.
Yeah.
Because when you look and you see that is the end of all men and all women. That's it. That's what's going to happen to all of us at one point or another. We're all going to pass on. And then you'll have enough. So what am I holding on to it for? And it's unbelievable how this kind of thing becomes something that once you realize our mortality and you realize that actually there's no point in holding on to this forever, you can start letting go. But it's also having the realization. I know my mother once was invited to give a speech on forgiveness somewhere. A friend of hers called her up and said, there are two women, friends of ours, that are in a machlokes. So I'm going to make a big shalashudas and invite all of our friends, like the greater circle, like 20, 30 of them, and you'll speak about forgiveness, and then hopefully we'll be able to make shalom that way. So my mother said, fine, no issues. They made the shalashudas. Just with their luck, on that day, the heavens opened up and it was pouring with rain. It was absolutely, people got drenched. One of the two ladies didn't show. And they're like, all right, one of them's not here, but the other one, at least hopefully she's going to hear the drasha and she's going to think about it. So my mother gave this whole drasha about forgiveness and everything. And at the end of the drasha, the other lady who the drasha was given for came over to my mother and said to my mother, that was beautiful. That was a really, really nice drasha. Just has very little to do with me. There's nobody that I'm in an argument with.
I just wish that so-and-so was here to listen to it.
And we look at other people and sometimes we think like, I don't have to forgive them. I have nobody to ask forgiveness from. They need to ask forgiveness from me. And sometimes this self-introspection, I think, before Rosh Hashana, to be able to look at ourselves honestly and to look at yourself in the mirror and to be willing to say, you know what? Maybe I didn't call all the people I was supposed to call. Maybe I didn't call my parents as often as I was meant to, my siblings as often as I was meant to. Maybe I didn't treat my wife or my husband as nicely as I was supposed to over the year. There are people that are nearest and dearest to us are probably the ones on whom we trample on the most. It's not the people that are somehow like, the backbenchers in the shul. It's really the people that are nearest to you that's where you should really be starting. You should start with your spouse and say, listen, there's so many times this year where really I should have.
This is a very dangerous conversation to start. This is a very dangerous conversation to start. By saying, listen, I'm aware there may have been some times where I did things wrong. Sometimes where you did things wrong?
Well, I've actually written down twice or three times when you've done things right for you this year.
No, but I think what you're saying is true, because I think that by and large, when you get to Yom Kippur and you're looking down all the Ashamnu Bagadnuds and you're going through all of that stuff, all the El Chaitz, sometimes we're a little bit too sure that these don't really apply to me, but I'm going to say them anyway. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I didn't do all of these, but it's the things that you do by accident, by sometimes not even knowing that you willingly. You didn't plan to go and hurt somebody. You didn't plan to say something that made somebody feel this big. You didn't plan to not pay somebody on time or whatever it may have been. And so there are millions of instances in our own lives where I think we need to go looking for those, really, in order to be able to account for them properly.
Yeah, and that's part of what Elul is for. Elul, the run up to Rosh Hashana, is really for you to start that introspection. You know, when you're standing on Rosh Hashana and davening Shemona Esrei, and at that point you want to try and remember what you did or you didn't do wrong, chances are it's not really going to come to you. But if you take time now for the next even week, just between now and Shabbos, it's not even that long. So you got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 5 days. That's all it is. The next 5 days, you say to yourself, for 2 minutes a day, I'm going to go through the people that are closest to me, or the people I might have had a disagreement with, or my coworkers. You know, coworkers is another big example of people that you might not treat well. You know, you make your coworkers, oh, go bring me a coffee, make that photocopy, please. You know, maybe just ask nicely. Even if you are sort of their superior or you're their boss, so to speak, that doesn't make you in charge of them.
Well, it doesn't excuse you for manners, really, or treating.
No.
I think it all comes down to treating another person with respect as a human being and making them feel valued as well.
Yeah, but we often forget to do that. Yes, we don't, and sometimes we're not even doing it on purpose. You know what? If you're really busy and you're in the middle of a meeting and you needed 2 photocopies and you just go over 2 copies, you know, and you're on the phone and you're in the middle of talking to someone and you needed 2 photocopies, like, you know, copy this, you know. It can happen.
And that's so important, and that's why when that story where he was asked to summarize the entire Torah in 1 sentence, you have to treat people like you want to be treated yourself at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And try and never forget that. But now is a really good time to have a look at that introspection. Rabbi, we've kept you for an hour. I'm sure you've got other things to do as well.
Sure.
I really value your time and looking at these different subjects as we get closer to Rosh Hashana. I'd like to thank everybody that has tuned in this evening, as well as D-Bar, our new fan.
D-Bar, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. And that's it. So I think unless there's anything else to add, I do know, by the way, for anybody that's listening, that there is progress being made with the things that we discussed last week. This week we'll see some more progress, and please God, I think we found a way to bring children to shul in the not too distant future.
Yeah, we're hoping. I mean, it's not going to be at the same time as the adults because we've said that they're going to be separate, but we are making progress in that direction. Absolutely.
Fantastic. I know it'll be a great relief for parents, but also because shul is such an important part of a child's experience of Yom Tov as well.
Yeah,
it's what we remember. Great. Okay, so I'm going to let you all go. Have a great week.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Take care. Have a good night.
See you soon.